The history of the British elite is often defined by the preservation of wealth and the guarding of a name. Yet behind the polished mahogany doors of private clubs and the grandstands of the nation's racecourses, a more destructive pattern has frequently emerged. For many who reached the absolute summit of their professions, the thrill of the win became more intoxicating than the success itself. These are not just stories of bad luck, they are accounts of systematic professional and personal erasure. We explore 12 individuals who held the world in their hands, only to watch their homes, their savings, and their peace of mind vanish into the pockets of others. This is the chronicle of the moment when a lifetime of work was traded for a final losing play. At number 1 is Sid James. Sid James was the rugged, cackling face of the Carry On film franchise and a beloved star of British sitcoms like Hancock's Half Hour. His career provided him with a steady and substantial income, making him one of the most recognizable and well-paid actors of the 1950s and 60s. With his iconic persona and immense popularity, he was a man who should have enjoyed a life of absolute financial comfort, possessing the resources to provide a luxurious future for his family and a secure retirement for himself. The conflict arose from a deep-seated and compulsive addiction to gambling that defined his entire adult life. James was a man who could not resist a wager, frequently losing his entire week's salary at the casino or on the horses before he had even returned home from the studio. His addiction was so severe that he often had to ask film producers for advances on his wages just to settle his immediate debts. This perpetual cycle of loss created a frantic domestic environment where his professional brilliance was constantly being used to pay for his private failures at the table, leaving him with no lasting savings despite his massive earnings. The consequence was a life lived in a state of permanent financial anxiety, where every role he took was driven by the necessity of debt rather than artistic choice. When he died suddenly on stage in 1976, he left behind a family that was shockingly under-resourced. Considering his decades at the top of the industry, the vast majority of the millions he had earned had been funneled directly into the pockets of bookmakers and casino owners, leaving his estate in a state of near insolvency. He remains a legend of British comedy, but his personal history is a tragic account of a man who was rich in talent, yet ended his life with nothing but the clothes on his back. At number 2 is Bobby Davro. Bobby Davro was a cornerstone of British primetime television in the 1980s, a versatile impressionist and comedian whose Saturday night shows attracted audiences in the tens of millions. Emerging from the vibrant South Coast entertainment circuit, he achieved a level of fame that translated into lucrative contracts and a lifestyle of significant material success. To the viewing public, he was the ultimate showman, a performer whose professional trajectory appeared to be an endless climb toward the top of the British media establishment, backed by a fortune that promised long-term stability. The conflict emerged from a private addiction to wagering that began to quietly hollow out the foundations of his success. While he was earning vast sums at the peak of his career, Davro was frequently losing thousands of pounds in a single afternoon at the racecourse or within the secluded rooms of London's casinos. His competitive nature, which drove his success on stage, became a liability when applied to the unpredictability of the gamble. As the entertainment landscape began to shift in the 1990s and his high-paying television contracts became less frequent, the mounting losses from his habits created a silent financial crisis that he struggled to manage. The consequence was a public struggle with insolvency that saw the comedian lose the vast majority of the wealth he had accumulated during his golden years. He was forced to sell his luxury properties and move into more modest circumstances, a transition that was documented with brutal honesty in the British press. Despite his ongoing work in pantomime and reality television, the independent wealth of his youth had been entirely consumed by his penchant for the bet. His story is a clinical example of how a high-earning career can be neutralized by a persistent habit, leaving a veteran performer to work well into his later years just to maintain a basic level of financial security. At number 3 is Des O'Connor. Des O'Connor. Des O'Connor was one of the most enduring and successful figures in the history of British light entertainment, a singer and talk show host whose career spanned over 6 decades. Known for his self-deprecating humor and his ability to put world-class guests at ease, he was a high-value asset for major networks, earning millions through his long-running variety shows and international recording success. His public image was one of absolute professional discipline and financial prudence, a man who represented the steady, reliable heart of the British entertainment industry. The conflict, however, involved a significant period of his life where his passion for the racecourse threatened to dismantle the very empire he had built. O'Connor was a dedicated enthusiast of horse racing, but his his involvement went far beyond simple spectating. He was known within inner circles for placing substantial wagers that occasionally reached levels that concerned his financial advisors. During the middle of his career, a series of catastrophic losses nearly brought his personal estate to a breaking point, forcing him to take on an exhausting schedule of live performances and international tours to recoup his reserves and keep his creditors at bay. The consequence was a quiet but absolute restructuring of his finances that remained hidden from his millions of fans. While he managed to avoid the public ignominy of bankruptcy through sheer hard work, the invisible loss of his early fortune meant that he had to remain professionally active far longer than many of his peers. He eventually regained his stability, but the experience left him with a profound understanding of how quickly a legacy can be endangered by a single afternoon at the track. He died a wealthy man, but his journey serves as a reminder that even the most polished careers are often balanced on a knife edge of private financial risk. At number 4 is Freddie Starr. Freddie Starr was one of the most explosive and unpredictable forces in British comedy, a man whose manic energy and eccentric performances made him a massive star in the 1970s and 80s. At the height of his fame, he was earning tens of thousands of pounds a week, owning racehorses, and living in palatial homes that reflected his status as a premier entertainer. To the public, he was an untouchable figure of the variety era, a man whose unique brand of humor had secured him a fortune that appeared to be inexhaustible. The conflict was a combination of an extravagant lifestyle and a devastatingly expensive habit of wagering on his own racehorses and high-stakes casino games. Starr's unpredictable nature on stage was mirrored in his financial life. He would place massive bets on a whim, often losing enormous sums in a single day of racing. This lack of fiscal control, coupled with his increasingly erratic public behavior, led to a slow but certain dismantling of his wealth. As his popularity waned and his professional opportunities decreased, the debts he had accumulated during his prime began to catch up with him, leading to a series of legal and financial battles that stripped him of his assets. The consequence was a total and humiliating fall from grace that saw the comedian spend his final years in self-imposed exile in Spain. He was eventually declared bankrupt, losing his homes and his savings to settle decades of unpaid obligations and gambling losses. The man who had once been the highest-paid entertainer in the country died in 2019 in a small rented apartment, his millions long gone and his legacy shadowed by a history of financial recklessness. He remains a symbol of the era's excesses, a performer whose talent was eventually consumed by the very same volatility that had made him a star. At number 5 is Terry Thomas. Terry Thomas was the personification of the charming British rogue, an actor whose portrayals of upper-class characters made him a staple of international cinema. His successful career in the 1950s and 60s provided him with a significant fortune, allowing him to maintain an extravagant lifestyle that mirrored the roles he played on screen. He lived in a sprawling Mediterranean villa and was a regular at the most exclusive clubs in London, appearing to the world as a man of permanent financial security and refined taste. The conflict was fueled by a lifelong obsession with grand gestures and a deep-seated addiction to horse racing and social wagering. He viewed his wealth not as a resource to be preserved, but as a means for a final winning play. As his health began to decline due to Parkinson's disease, his ability to earn a living vanished, yet his compulsion to wager remained. He continued to risk massive sums in a desperate attempt to recoup his dwindling resources, a strategy that only accelerated his path toward insolvency as the wins became rarer and the requirements for his care grew. The consequence was a heartbreaking transition from a life of splendor to one of absolute poverty. In his final years, the man who had once defined British luxury was forced to live in a small, charity-funded apartment, his vast fortune entirely consumed by his losses and rising medical bills. A benefit concert was eventually held by his fellow actors just to provide him with basic living expenses. He died in 1990, a legend of the screen who had successfully traded every remnant of his professional success for a series of losing hands. At number 6 is Alex Higgins. Alex "Hurricane" Higgins was the individual who turned snooker into a televised spectacle, a two-time world champion whose erratic genius captivated millions during the 1980s. He earned millions during the peak of the sport's popularity, becoming a working-class hero who lived a life of fast cars, expensive suits, and constant public attention. To his fans, he was an untouchable force, a man who had revolutionized his field and secured his family's future through his sheer brilliance on the table. The conflict arose from a personality that demanded constant stimulation, leading him to the betting shops almost as frequently as the snooker halls. Higgins was a compulsive wagerer who who would put money on anything from greyhounds to the weather, often losing tens of thousands of pounds in a single afternoon. His volatile temperament meant that he rarely walked away from a losing streak, instead increasing his bets in a frantic effort to prove his mastery over chance. This addiction created a financial void that swallowed his prize money as quickly as he could earn it. The consequence was a total and public erasure of his wealth. By the end of his life, Higgins was living in a sheltered housing apartment in Belfast, his health broken and his millions gone. He was often seen in local betting shops trying to turn a few pounds into a fortune with the same desperate intensity he once used to win world titles. He died in 2010, a man who had once held the world in his hands but ended his journey with nothing, a victim of the very same unpredictable energy that had initially made him a champion. At number 7 is John Aspinall. John Aspinall was a prominent figure in the British upper class, a man whose social circle included the most powerful politicians and aristocrats of the 1960s. He was a pioneer of the legal gaming scene in London, founding a legendary club where the elite gathered to play for sums that could change the course of a family's history. Aspinall himself was a man of immense ambition, using his profits to fund his true passion, the creation of private zoos for endangered animals, viewing himself as a guardian of the natural world. The conflict was born from Aspinall's own inability to resist the very games he managed. While he made a fortune from the losses of others, he frequently sat on the other side of the table, wagering vast sums of his own money to maintain his standing among his wealthy peers. His philosophy was one of extreme risk, believing that a man's character was forged in moments of total financial peril. This led to several occasions where his entire operation, including the funding for his beloved animals, was endangered by a single night of poor results. The consequence was a life lived in a state of permanent financial instability, despite the outward appearance of grandeur. While he managed to maintain his zoos, the cost was the total depletion of his personal wealth and a series of desperate maneuvers to keep creditors at bay. He became a man who was rich in assets but often lacked the liquid cash to pay his staff, living a paradoxical existence where a single bad week at the table could have resulted in the literal starvation of his animals. He died in 2000, a man who had survived a lifetime of wagering but left behind a legacy as fragile as the species he sought to protect. At number 8 is Jimmy Tarbuck. Jimmy Tarbuck was a central pillar of British variety television, a man whose quick wit and approachable charm made him the face of Sunday night at the London Palladium. Rising from a working-class background in Liverpool, he became one of the highest-paid entertainers of the 1960s and 70s, commanding a massive following and a fortune that allowed him to move within the most exclusive social circles. To the viewing public, he was the personification of the self-made success story, a beloved figure whose professional achievements seemed to guarantee a life of permanent financial security and refined leisure. The conflict emerged from a deep-seated obsession with the atmosphere of the betting shop and the racecourse. While he was a talented socialite, his competitive drive often spilled over into private wagering that moved far beyond recreational play. He became a regular fixture in the secluded rooms of London's most prestigious gaming establishments, where the excitement of the wager began to overshadow the satisfaction of his comedic career. As the losses began to accumulate, a silent financial pressure was created, requiring him to work harder and longer just to maintain the facade of his extravagant lifestyle. The consequence was a period of significant financial instability that threatened to erase decades of professional advancement. While Tarbuck managed to remain a public figure, the private toll of his habits meant that much of his vast earnings were redirected toward settling obligations rather than building a lasting family estate. He transitioned from a man of independent wealth to an entertainer who was perpetually required to perform, working well into his later years to ensure his financial commitments were met. His story serves as a reminder that even the most successful career can become a treadmill when the thrill of the play becomes a necessity. At number 9 is Lord Lucan. Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, was a prominent member of the British aristocracy and a central figure in an elite group of high society gamblers. Known for his cold, unshakable demeanor at the card table, he was a man of immense inherited prestige who moved through the exclusive clubs of Mayfair with an air of total authority. To the outside world, he represented the pinnacle of the British landed gentry, a man whose lineage and wealth appeared to be an impenetrable fortress of social and financial security. The conflict arose from a series of catastrophic losses that began to hollow out the Lucan estate. Despite his outward appearance of prosperity, he was drowning in debt, losing thousands of pounds in single sittings while his marriage and personal life began to fracture under the strain. The desperation to recoup these losses led him into increasingly risky financial maneuvers, creating a cycle of panic that eventually culminated in a dark and violent night in 1974. The wagering was not just a hobby, it was the engine of his destruction, stripping him of his judgment and his dignity long before he vanished from the public eye. The consequence was a total collapse of a centuries-old dynasty and a disappearance that remains one of Britain's greatest mysteries. Lucan left behind a mountain of debt and a family in ruins, his name transitioning from a title of nobility to a synonym for scandal and tragedy. He proved that even the most ancient titles provide no protection against the madness of the gamble. He vanished into the shadows, a man who had wagered his entire life on a final desperate play and lost everything, including his place in the world he was born to lead. At number 10 is Peter McHenry. Peter McHenry was a highly respected actor of the British stage and screen, a man whose performances for the Royal Shakespeare Company and in classic films earned him a reputation as a sophisticated and intellectual performer. With his striking looks and immense talent, he was a leading man of the 1960s and 70s, earning a substantial income that should have seen him live a life of comfort and artistic freedom. He was viewed by his peers as a reliable professional, a man whose career was built on discipline and a deep commitment to his craft. The conflict developed in the private rooms of London's clubs, where McHenry sought an escape from the pressures of the theatrical world. What began as a social distraction evolved into a compulsive habit that began to consume his professional earnings. He was a man of quiet intensity, but that same focus was turned toward the gaming tables, where he frequently lost significant sums in a single evening. The addiction was hidden from the public eye, but it created a hollowed-out financial reality that stood in stark contrast to his successful and polished public image. The consequence was a career that was increasingly driven by the need to pay off mounting debts rather than artistic passion. McHenry found himself taking roles he might otherwise have declined, his financial instability dictating the trajectory of his professional life. While he remained a working actor, the vast wealth his talent had generated was largely absorbed by the betting industry, leaving him with little to show for decades at the top of his profession. His story is a clinical example of how a private addiction can quietly dismantle the foundations of a successful life, leaving an individual to navigate their later years without the security their hard work should have provided. At number 11 is Willie Carson. Willie Carson was a titan of the British turf, a four-time champion jockey whose career was defined by an extraordinary tactical mind and an infectious personality. For decades, he was a permanent fixture in the winner's enclosure, securing victories in the most prestigious races, including the Epsom Derby. This professional success brought with it a level of wealth and national recognition that placed him among the sporting elite, providing him with the resources to establish his own successful stud farm and secure a legacy far beyond his days in the saddle. The conflict emerged from the very environment that had made him famous. Like many within the racing industry, the transition from being a participant to a spectator was fraught with financial peril. Carson's deep knowledge of the sport led him to believe he could consistently outmaneuver the odds, resulting in a series of substantial wagers that began to drain his personal reserves. The excitement of the racecourse, which had once been his workplace, became a source of significant financial drain as he sought to replicate the thrill of victory through the betting slip, often risking sums that far exceeded his regular income. The consequence was a period of severe financial strain that forced a restructuring of his professional and personal life. While he remained a respected voice in racing media, the immense fortune he had built during his riding career was significantly diminished by his habits. He was forced to make difficult decisions regarding his business ventures and property, learning the hard way that the view from the grandstand is far more unpredictable than the view from the saddle. His story is a poignant example of how the very world that grants an individual their fame can also become the instrument of their financial struggle. At number 12 is Shane Ritchie. Shane Ritchie is a celebrated figure in British television, a multi-talented actor and presenter whose portrayal of Alfie Moon on EastEnders made him a national favorite. Before his rise to the top of the soap opera world, he was a high-earning entertainer on the holiday camp circuit and a successful stand-up comedian. His early career provided him with a significant income, allowing him to experience a level of financial freedom that seemed to set the stage for a life of permanent comfort and professional stability within the British media landscape. The conflict, however, developed during the mid-1990s, a period when his professional opportunities began to dwindle and his private financial management faltered. Ritchie has been candid about his struggles during this era, where a combination of extravagant living and a penchant for the betting shop began to erode his savings. The adrenaline of the wager, often used as a distraction from the pressures of a fluctuating career, created a silent deficit that eventually became unmanageable. What appeared to be a life of celebrity luxury was, in reality, a fragile facade held together by mounting debts and a series of losing plays that threatened his very survival in the industry. The consequence was a period of absolute financial ruin that saw the actor become homeless, sleeping in his car while struggling to find work. This total collapse served as a brutal awakening, forcing him to rebuild his life and career from nothing. While he eventually achieved massive success and restored his fortune through his iconic role in EastEnders, the experience of losing everything remained a defining chapter of his personal history. His story is a rare example of a shattered financial life that was successfully pieced back together, serving as both a cautionary tale of the gamble's cost and a testament to the resilience required to overcome ruin.